The microphone hit the studio floor with a metallic clang that echoed through the Family Feud, set like a gunshot. Steve Harvey's face transformed from television host to something entirely different. A man who had just witnessed something that crossed every line he'd ever drawn in the sand. The cameras kept rolling, but everyone in that studio knew they were about to see something unprecedented. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a reckoning. It had started as the perfect Tuesday afternoon taping. The energy in the Atlanta studio was electric, the way it always was when two competitive families faced off on America's favorite game show. Steve Harvey stood at his podium in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, working the crowd with that magnetic presence that had made him a household name. The studio lights caught the gold threading in his tie as he surveyed the two families at their respective podium. On the left stood the Morrison family from Ohio. 5 adults in matching blue polo shirts. Tom Morrison, the patriarch, was a high school football coach with an easy smile. His wife Linda taught kindergarten. Their 3 adult children completed the lineup, each carrying themselves with the confident posture of people who had never questioned their place in the world. On the right stood the Rodriguez family from East Los Angeles. Maria Rodriguez worked as a hospital nurse. Her husband, Carlos, ran an auto repair shop. Their daughter, Sophia, was pre-med at UCLA. Their son, Miguel, worked construction. And at the end of their podium, in a sleek black wheelchair, sat 16-year-old Marcus Rodriguez. Marcus had cerebral palsy, a condition that affected his motor control but left his brilliant mind completely intact. His speech required patience to understand, but anyone who took the time quickly discovered they were talking to someone with an IQ that had tested off the charts. He was the family's secret weapon, a teenager who read voraciously, absorbed information like a sponge, and had a particular gift for understanding exactly what survey respondents might say. Steve had noticed Marcus immediately during the family introductions. There was something about the teenager's eyes, alert, intelligent, watching everything with the kind of focus that suggested he saw details others missed. When Steve had knelt down to Marcus's level during introductions, the young man had looked directly at him and said, with the careful pronunciation he'd worked years to perfect, "Mr. Harvey, I watch your show every day. You make people feel like they matter." The comment had caught Steve off guard. In a world of practiced television responses, Marcus had offered something genuine, something that reminded Steve why he loved what he did. "Well, young man," Steve had replied, "that's because people do matter, every single one of them." The game had progressed normally through the first 2 rounds. The Morrisons had jumped to an early lead, but the Rodriguez family was fighting back. Marcus had already contributed 2 answers that landed on the board, his careful speech drawing supportive applause each time. During the 3rd round, everything changed. The category was "Name something people do when they're nervous." Sophia Rodriguez had just given the number 1 answer, "Bite their nails," and the family was celebrating their chance to play for points. The energy was high, competitive, but friendly, exactly the kind of atmosphere that made great television. That's when Tom Morrison made his comment. It happened during a brief pause as Steve was walking back to his podium. Marcus was conferring with his family about their next answer, his speech, a bit more labored than usual, due to excitement. The studio microphones weren't supposed to pick up side conversations, but Tom Morrison's voice carried further than he probably intended. "This kid, what's he gonna know anyway? How's that even fair?" The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. At first, only the families in the front row of the audience heard it. The Rodriguez family froze. Marcus's face changed, not with hurt, but with the kind of recognition that comes when someone confirms your worst fears about how the world sees you. Steve Harvey had been walking back to his podium when the comment reached his ears. He stopped mid-stride. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The easy smile vanished. The entertainer's posture straightened into something more dangerous. When he turned toward the Morrison family, everyone in that studio understood that something had fundamentally shifted. "Excuse me," Steve said, his voice cutting through the studio's ambient noise like a blade. "Did somebody say something?" The studio fell silent. Tom Morrison's face went pale as he realized his comment had been heard. His family members looked at him with expressions ranging from embarrassment to horror. Linda Morrison closed her eyes as if she could make the moment disappear. Steve Harvey set his cards down on his podium with deliberate precision. "No, no, no," he said, his voice gaining volume with each word. "I heard something, and we're gonna address it right now." He stepped away from his podium and began walking toward the Morrison family. The cameras tracked his movement, capturing every step of what was becoming the most intense moment in Family Feud history. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud, gasp, or remain silent. "Tom," Steve said, using the man's first name with an authority that suggested he was no longer asking permission for anything. "You got something you want to share with all of us?" Tom Morrison shifted uncomfortably, looking around the studio as if searching for an escape route. I didn't mean anything by it, Steve. I was just—" "You were just what?" Steve's voice was quiet now, which somehow made it more menacing than if he had been shouting. "You were just questioning whether a young man with cerebral palsy belongs on this stage. You were just suggesting that his disability makes this competition unfair?" The words hit Tom Morrison like physical blows. "No, that's not what I meant." But Steve Harvey wasn't interested in backtracking or diplomatic solutions. He continued his approach until he was standing directly in front of the Morrison family podium. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every injustice he'd ever witnessed, every underestimated person he'd ever encountered. "Let me tell you something about that young man," Steve said, pointing toward Marcus without taking his eyes off Tom Morrison. "That kid you're so worried about, he's read more books than you have. He's overcome more challenges in his 16 years than most people face in a lifetime. And right now, he's showing more class and dignity than you are." The studio audience began to murmur, a low rumble of agreement and support. Steve raised his hand for silence and got it immediately. "But you know what the real issue is here, Tom. It's not about fairness. It's about respect. And right now, you're showing a complete lack of respect for a young man who deserves nothing but admiration." Marcus Rodriguez sat in his wheelchair, watching this unfold with a mixture of emotions playing across his face. His family stood protectively around him, but Marcus himself looked more concerned for Steve Harvey than for himself. He'd faced prejudice before. He'd learned to navigate a world that often underestimated him, but he'd never had someone fight for him like this, on national television, in front of millions of viewers. Steve Harvey turned away from Tom Morrison and walked directly to Marcus. The teenager looked up at the host who had just defended him with such fierce protectiveness, and something passed between them that the cameras captured, but couldn't fully convey. A moment of mutual respect, understanding, and connection. "Marcus," Steve said, his voice now gentle, but still carrying that underlying steel. "I want you to know something. You belong here, you belong anywhere you want to be, and anybody who suggests otherwise is going to have to deal with me." The studio erupted. The audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause that seemed to go on forever. The Rodriguez family was crying, not tears of sadness, but tears of gratitude and recognition. Even some members of the Morrison family were applauding, clearly embarrassed by their patriarch's comment and moved by Steve's response. But Steve Harvey wasn't finished. He walked back to center stage, commanding the attention of everyone in the studio and everyone watching at home. When he spoke, it was with the authority of someone who had spent decades in entertainment and understood the power of the platform he'd been given. "Let me tell you something, everybody," he said, his voice now carrying beyond the studio to the millions of viewers who would see this moment. "This show isn't just about games and prizes, it's about families. It's about respect. It's about recognizing that every person who steps onto this stage has value, has dignity, has something to contribute." He paused, letting his words sink in. And when someone suggests that a person's disability makes them less capable, less deserving, or less worthy of respect, that's not just wrong, it's unacceptable. And it stops right here, right now. The cameras captured every word, every gesture, every expression on Steve Harvey's face as he delivered what was essentially a sermon disguised as a game show moment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was education. This was advocacy. This was a man using his platform to draw a line in the sand and declare that some things would not be tolerated. Steve walked back to Marcus one more time. The teenager had been watching everything with those intelligent eyes, taking in not just the words, but the moment, understanding that something significant was happening. "Marcus," Steve said, kneeling down to the teenager's eye level, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you want to continue this game?" Marcus looked at Steve, then at his family, then at the Morrison family, who were standing in various states of shame and embarrassment. When he spoke, his words were clear and measured, delivered with the kind of dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are. "Mr. Harvey," Marcus said, "I came here to play this game. I came here to show people what my family can do. And I'm not going anywhere until we finish what we started." The studio exploded. Again, Steve Harvey stood up, a huge smile breaking across his face for the first time since Tom Morrison's comment. "That's what I'm talking about," he said. "That's the attitude of a champion." Steve walked back to his podium, picked up his cards, and looked directly at the Morrison family. Tom Morrison stood there, clearly understanding that he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that he had revealed something about himself in front of millions of people that would follow him long after the cameras stopped rolling. "Now," Steve said, his voice returning to its familiar cadence, but still carrying that edge of steel, "we're going to continue this game. We're going to play it with respect, with dignity, and with the understanding that every person on this stage deserves to be here." The game resumed, but it was transformed. Every answer Marcus gave was met with thunderous applause. The Morrison family, clearly rattled by their patriarch's gaffe and Steve's response, struggled to regain their footing. Tom Morrison himself seemed to shrink with each passing question, the weight of his words and their consequences clearly affecting his ability to concentrate. During the fast money round, something extraordinary happened. Marcus, despite his speech challenges, delivered answer after answer with perfect clarity, as if Steve Harvey's defense had somehow freed him from any self-consciousness he might have felt. When the final scores were revealed, the Rodriguez family had won decisively. As confetti fell and the Rodriguez family celebrated, Steve Harvey made one final gesture that would be remembered long after the episode aired. He walked to Marcus, removed his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping, the one that had become part of his television persona, and draped it over the teenager's shoulders. "Champions look out for each other," Steve said quietly, though his wireless microphone picked up every word. "And today, you showed everyone what a real champion looks like." The jacket was enormous on Marcus's slight frame, but he wore it like a medal of honor. The image of the teenager in his wheelchair, wearing Steve Harvey's jacket and surrounded by his celebrating family, became one of the most powerful photographs in game show history. As the cameras stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, Tom Morrison approached the Rodriguez family. His face was flushed with shame. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He stood in front of Marcus, for a long moment before speaking. "Son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology. What I said was wrong, and I'm sorry." Marcus looked up at the man who had questioned his presence on the stage just an hour earlier. When he spoke, it was with the kind of grace that comes from understanding that forgiveness is often more powerful than anger. "Mr. Morrison," Marcus said, "we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after we make them." The episode aired 6 months later, exactly as it happened, with no editing to soften Steve Harvey's response or minimize the impact of the moment. The reaction was unlike anything in television history. Disability rights organizations praised Steve's instant and uncompromising defense of Marcus. The clip went viral within hours, generating millions of views and thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of overcoming prejudice and low expectations. Steve Harvey received hundreds of letters from families with disabled children, thanking him for showing their kids that they had value, that they belonged, that someone was willing to fight for them. Marcus Rodriguez became a spokesperson for cerebral palsy awareness, traveling the country to share his story and inspire others. But perhaps the most powerful change was in Tom Morrison himself. The man who had made that thoughtless comment became an advocate for disability inclusion in his community. He started a program at his high school to create opportunities for students with disabilities. The suit jacket that Steve gave Marcus that day hangs framed in the teenager's bedroom next to his high school diploma and his acceptance letter to Stanford University, where he's studying computer science. Marcus still watches Family Feud every day, but now he sees it differently. He sees it as the place where someone stood up for him when he couldn't fully stand up for himself. And Steve Harvey, he learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every contestant, every moment he spends in front of those cameras. He learned that sometimes being a host means being more than an entertainer. Sometimes it means being a defender, a voice for those who need one, a person willing to use their platform to say what needs to be said, regardless of the consequences. The microphone that hit the floor that day was picked up within seconds, but the impact of what happened when Steve Harvey stopped being just a game show host and started being a human being defending another human being, that continues to resonate, reminding us all that dignity isn't negotiable, respect isn't optional, and sometimes the most important moments in television happen when someone decides that being right is more important than being polite.